Hello, it's Chris Titley here, and welcome to this week's episode of Scoreboard. And today I'm joined by Paul Roos. Paul, thank you so much for being part of this series.
No worries. Good to chat to you. Thanks.
Paul, I'm going to go straight to the crux. Australian rules football, AFL. Can you tell the listeners out there why it's been so important, or in your life from the early days as a young kid?
I mean, probably a number of reasons. There's a reason of connection, which I think sport gives you a really good connection because we're all looking for, trying to fit in, whether that's at school when I went to Domo High School or whether, go to university or when you go to work. So I was really fortunate to play a lot of sport growing up. So I think the significance was firstly, just finding a group of like-minded people, and going down to Fitzroy, I was able to do that. And then I guess it goes to the competition aspect. You enjoy the competition, you enjoy winning, you don't enjoy losing too much. And then as it rolls on, it becomes more and more important because, it sustains your family. You're able to buy a house. Then you're in it coaching the Sydney Swans, and it just becomes a massive part of your life. So it probably starts, as I said, as connection, and it goes into different stages, really.
As a kid, that connection that you just mentioned about, do you remember when it started and how it started?
I think the sport I always felt connected to sport, maybe because I was always pretty good at it, but I always loved being outside. I played basketball as well and tennis. I love tennis. I love basketball. I love football. To be honest, football was probably third. I love basketball probably first, and maybe then tennis and football equal second. But I just always loved running and competing and having fun and hanging out with my mates. And it seemed like a really good way to hang out with your mates, just shooting hoops and kicking the footy and playing tennis. So I think from an early age, I just felt really connected to my teammates, really.
And when you're growing up playing basketball, did you have any aspirations as a kid to play professional basketball or professional football? Was that in the Paul Roos dream?
Well, back then it was just play, really. I think it's a little bit different today, where I think players intentionally start to think about playing Australian rules football or, playing for Australia in basketball or going to the RIS. Back then it was very much a game. I just played a game of basketball, a game of tennis, a game of football. But I was lucky I made the state, under 13s, 15s and 17s in basketball. So I was obviously a pretty good basketballer as well as footballer. But I never really thought about what I could do with basketball, probably because I got invited down to play with Fitzroy. My contemporaries, Damien Keogh was a year above me, Andrew Gaze was a year below, both Olympians, both, played against them growing up, more so Damien than Andrew. But I suppose for me it was just getting invited down to Fitzroy meant that was what I was going to do. I never thought about basketball playing for Australia because I guess, to think about yourself as one of the best 12 players in Australia, but also the fact that I was down at Fitzroy as a 16-year-old probably helped me make that decision anyway.
And in regards to the enjoyment of the sport, which did you prefer at the time, at sort of 16?
Probably basketball, because you were able to, you played indoors and the game was over in an hour and a half. And I remember going on tournaments where you'd play 5 or 6 games a weekend, which I loved, and you're able to train and you're able to shoot baskets, and probably purely enjoyment. I actually enjoyed basketball more than football. It was a line ball, but, just for those reasons, I just love playing basketball.
And Paul, as an early sports person growing up, there's some traits that I've spoken to in my last episodes about the word resilience and how important that is. Can you talk about your involvement with resilience, and potentially at a young age, I suppose, and not being picked in particular teams to drive you a bit harder?
Yeah, I think sport always teaches you resilience, because whether you're the best player or the worst player, you're on a team that wins or loses, And I think one of the things that's been taken away from kids is that winning and losing. And we're now looking at participation. And I think my boys started on the edge of, the Auskick not scoring. And guess what the first thing the kids said after the game? Who won? I mean, everyone wants to know who won. And I always used to say, if I umpired the games, it was a draw. And the kids would go, no, it wasn't. So everyone knows So I think the very nature of sport teaches you resilience, because we all have injuries, we all lose. Even the most successful players lose at different stages, and even the most successful players have injuries, and challenges. So I think the nature of sport means if you lose, in round one, you have to play again in round two. If you lose, even if you get to a grand final and you win the grand final, that happens very rarely. Lee Matthews had a really good saying. Even the most successful coaches have a win-loss ratio of 66% or 63%. So they're losing every third week. And even the best teams in the competition, using Brisbane Lions as an example, won 3 in a row and hadn't won until this previous. So I think sport just teaches you resilience because of the very nature of what it represents.
And when you come off those games that you lose, I mean, do you still manage to have an element of fun out of it, I suppose, or is it you come off thinking, okay, how can I improve, and then you lose again, Is there a point where you go, oh, this is too hard, I sort of want to throw in the towel?
Probably my time at Fitzroy was the hardest. We had problems off field financially. I think we started 0-10 one year. Players weren't getting paid on time. So that taught me a lot about that. And the reality, as you said, you had to keep on playing. You can't sort of go to the coach on Monday and say, look, we're 0-9 or 0-10 or whatever we were, and I'm not getting paid. I'm not turning up on the weekend. So those things, teach you a lot about life and resilience, because even though, my payments were often due in March or July or December, we got paid 3 times a year. And it might be middle of April and I hadn't got any money. Now, it wasn't like I couldn't turn up to the game on the weekend, because everyone would have known, well, Paul Roos hasn't turned up. I think I was captain of the club at that time, So, I remember those things. And whilst they were frustrating at the time, they certainly taught me really valuable lessons now. And when I look back and I realise not how fortunate I was, because you're never fortunate when you're not getting paid, or fortunate that you're playing in a bad team. But I think there's a really good saying that, things happen, for you, not to you, and the reason they happen was for me, and what was the lessons I learned from them.
At your peak, you're one of the great AFL players. I'm interested to know what characteristics and traits that you worked on the most during that time when you were at your peak. Was it skills? Was it fitness? Was it eating? Was it all sorts of different things? And how much, I suppose, was up here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's sort of hard to analyse yourself. When I get asked that question, it's sort of hard to know. But I think my greatest strength was knowing what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. And I think that's really important, because sometimes we focus too heavily on the things we're not good at, and then we start to work on them. And I'm not suggesting you don't do that. But I think the really good players that I've seen know what they're really good at and make sure they're their absolute superpowers. And I think that was my case. I wasn't a great athlete, but I was a pretty good endurance runner. So I made sure I ran really hard in every game and tried to outrun my opponent. I think through basketball and tennis, through playing other sports, I was really smart and I could read the game really well. And I used that to my advantage. So I think they were my greatest traits. And I think when you say above the shoulders, I think a lot of what I did was above the shoulders, thinking through the games, thinking through my opponents. And that was before we really did a lot of analysis on our opposition. But I always remember, if I'm playing on Stephen Kernahan, he would do this. If I played on Terry Danaher, he would do this. If I played on Peter Foster, Wayne Carey, I had to play like this. So I think a lot of my game was played above the shoulders, and I was able to translate that into, almost visualising the game before visualisation became, normal or normalised. What was the game going to look like, and how was I going to have to play the game, and play that out before I actually played on the weekends.
And the night before games, what did you have a ritual? Were you superstitious? Were you nervous? Were you excited?
Very superstitious. Most players are superstitious. I'd get to bed at 9:30. I'd eat spaghetti bolognese. I'd get up at 10 and have 8 pieces of toast before. Yeah, everything's really, really superstitious before a game. I was never really nervous. I was pretty calm, probably more excited than nervous, because, you got to remember back when I was playing, training was almost harder than the games. So when you got to game day, it was almost a relief going, oh, fantastic. I actually don't have to train. I'm going to go and play a game today. And it was somewhat cathartic just to be able to go out and play your own game without a 2.5 hour, 3 hour session on a Tuesday night and the coach screaming and yelling at you and then getting off and trudging home and eating dinner at about 8 o'clock at night and getting to bed, then going to work the next day. So games were actually pretty cool because you're able to sleep in, you're able to get the footy on your own time, watch the seconds play, hang out with your mates, and then run out in the field, which was pretty cool.
Paul, I'm interested in your time at Fitzroy and then moving to Sydney as an AFL, as a national game, and your time at Sydney and the way that Sydney progressed through that became the city in terms of AFL, and also now, obviously from Brisbane winning this year, that Brisbane-Sydney final, AFL is now a national game. Do you look back at the impact that Swans team had at the time? Yeah,
no question. I think there's two things that I look back. I mean, look, more than two, but I think there's two significant things. In my time, I think Tony Lockett going to Sydney was incredibly significant. He was the biggest figure in AFL at the time, and Ron Barassi was up there, which was great. But then Tony coming in 96, I think, really put the Swans on the map, as well as the performance of making the grand final in 1996. I think that was enormous for the sport. We probably weren't ready to win a premiership because we started to gather support. And then obviously 2005, 9 years after playing in a grand final, then we had a lot more bolted on supporters, a lot more credibility, a lot more consistent, finals appearance, with Rodney Eade coaching 96 and through his tenure, and then myself. So I think we were ready to win it in 2005. As much as I would have wanted to love winning it in 96, I don't think the club was set up to win a premiership, or the AFL was set up to win a premiership. But in 2005, they were. And when you look at the national competition now, I think the 2005 premiership, on the back of the Brisbane Lions winning in 01, 02, 03, and then Port won it in 2004. But the Northern States, what Lee Matthews did with his team in 1, 2 and 3, and then what we were able to do in 05 and 06, playing back-to-back grand finals, I think significantly cemented the AFL as a truly national sport, particularly in the Northern States, New South Wales and Queensland.
Before we get into 05, I'm curious about 96, your experience looking back on it, the whole day, the whole fanfare of a grand final, what you did on the day, and I suppose the experience per se. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, when I went to Sydney in 94, end of 94 for 95, I didn't think we'd ever play in a grand final. I thought we'd maybe make the finals, with Tony coming up, with Paul Kelly, Andrew Dunkley, Darren Creswell, Mark Bay, some young players coming in, some other really good players, Kevin Dyson, Stewie Maxfield, Craig O'Brien. So I thought we started the nucleus of the team, but I didn't think we'd ever play in a grand final in 96. So that was amazing for me, not having been able to do it at Fitzroy, played in preliminary final. And it's sort of then it becomes your best footy day and your worst footy day rolled up into one, which is pretty weird. Your best footy day because you're playing in a grand final, you're running out in the MCG, you're absorbing the atmosphere, which is just incredible. And then the siren goes to start the game and the excitement of playing in the game. And then there's a point for us in the last quarter where you realise you're not going to win, and then the siren goes. So then the disappointment and the realisation of how hard it is to get there. And then you start to think, gee, am I ever going to get there again? So it's a great day and a bad day all rolled up into one.
It sounds like sport, the analogy, all in one day.
Yeah, it is. I mean, if you sort of could put your career in one day, it probably is a great analogy of what it looks like. You get the highs, you get the lows, and if you win it, then it's extremely fortunate. If you lose it, you're disappointed. So, and that's what sport teaches you. That's what sport's all about. And as much as we want to win every game, as I said before, sport is a lot about bouncing back and losing. That's the nature of when you choose to become an athlete. That's what can happen.
And Paul, when you retired from AFL, was it an easy decision? And then I suppose the transition post AFL into thinking about becoming a coach?
Yeah, pretty much. 1998, I think I might have been able to get another year, and I think the club might have said, look, would you think about coming back? And But I was pretty much done then. Your body, can't do what your mind wants it to do. And, when you become when you were a pretty good player and you start to lower your standard, that's pretty hard too, to sort of walk off the field knowing you can't do what you used to be able to do. So it was a pretty easy decision to retire. I then went overseas, lived with Tammy's parents for 10 months in America, which I enjoyed, did some research, a lot of sports I was able to go and visit, which is great. Came back in 2000, worked on the Olympics for C7, became a part-time coach. So it probably wasn't until the end of that year I started to become full-time assistant coach in 2001 that I started to think about, did I ever want to become an AFL coach? But I didn't even really think about that until Rodney Eade gave it away, and then they asked me to do the job. I always thought, I'm an assistant coach now. I'll take the time, the opportunity to learn the ropes, and then eventually I'll make the decision whether it's something I want to do. So even that decision came around really, really quickly.
And then 4 years from there, you're in a grand final again. What was the feeling like as a coach in 2005, being on the other side, I suppose, not as a player, and seeing all those players experience what you experienced as a player?
Yeah, it's dramatically different. Like as a coach, you're relying on so many people, your board, your CEO, your footy department, the players, obviously, medical fitness, everyone within the organisation. As a player, as much as you are relying on your teammates, there's no question about that. A lot of what you do is individual. You prepare yourself well, you eat well, you train well, you turn up, and then you're relying on your teammates on game day. So it's dramatically different. But to win a premiership as a coach was just amazing. And then you realise, as I said, how much time and effort goes into it, not just the people of that year, but when you run on the ground and you see past players, past administrators, fans, members, sponsors.
70 odd years.
Yeah, 72 years. And at the start of 2003, we were picked to finish on the bottom of the ladder. So it wasn't like we were expected to play in a premiership during that time. So, 72 years of past players, past administrators, members and sponsors, and then to run on the ground and the current group of players. I think you probably didn't realise the enormity of it at the time. You mentioned 72 years. And obviously, 69 years and 70 years and 71, and we'd heard the number over and over and over again. But I think until that happened, you probably didn't realise how many people were positively impacted by winning a premiership.
And Paul, do you look back on that day? Do you have distinct memories of that day?
Yeah, I do. I was really fortunate I sort of made a conscious effort the night before to try and, enjoy the situation, win, lose or draw, and because I'd done that. Everyone talks about being present, but I was really present after the game, and we stayed in the coach's box and we congratulated each other. I remember we were lucky. We actually coached during the time we were able to walk through the grandstand onto the ground, not go down the lift and then under the car park onto the ground. So I remember walking through the grandstand and seeing the smile of the fans cheering and hugging each other. And I remember getting on the ground, seeing family and friends and past players, administrators, current, and then getting the cup. And so the memories of the day are still very vivid in my mind, which is great.
And Paul, the question around the end of your coaching career then about what to do after that. Now you've been a player and then you've been a coach, and did you have something in mind? Were you working on something? What's Paul Roos doing now?
Yeah, well, I sort of always was interested in leadership and got always asked a lot about how you create a high-performing environment when I coached 2005 premiership, but also when I went to Melbourne. I think people were really impressed by what we were able to do at Melbourne and take a really, really bad team over 3 years. And, I think even some people said to me that was probably arguably a better effort than winning a premiership. They'd won 2 games and we got over 3 years to win 10, and then in 2022, I think it was, Simon Goodwin took them to a premiership. So, now I'm involved in a company called Performance by Design, which is a leadership company. We take a lot of those principles that we use from Sydney and Melbourne and transform them into the corporate world, which I really enjoy doing.
And Paul, the similarities between sport and the corporate world. Sport, you have this one game, I suppose, every weekend. In corporate world, you're there 5 days a week and the weekend's the rest. But I'm sure there's a number of similarities.
Yeah, absolutely similar now. I mean, sport became full-time for me and when I went to Sydney. So there's a transition from a semi-professional environment in the early 80s, mid-90s to fully professional in the mid-90s towards the end of that. So very, very similar. I mean, everyone's trying to create a high-performing team. What is culture? We're trying to reward good behaviours. We're trying to challenge poor behaviours. We talk about a culture code. Have you defined your culture? Do you know what it is? Are you building really strong relationships within your group? Are you having honest conversations? And really, the fundamentals of a high-performing team are exactly the same, whether that's the Sydney Swans, Melbourne Football Club, or some of the clients we work with.
I'm going to touch on that for a second. Are you a goal setter?
More process than goal setting. And I think I see them as the same thing. We will sort of set the process of what are the goals on the weekend, what do we have to achieve in order to win, and if we win enough games, then our goal is to play finals, and if we win enough games in finals, then our goal is so probably more around what is the process, which largely is about goal setting, but what are the daily things we have to do in order to achieve our monthly targets, and then our monthly targets in order to achieve our yearly targets.
And the big, hairy, audacious goal, do you have that in the back of your mind, or is it just week by week?
Yeah, I think you've always got to know where you're trying to head. There's no question about that. We always wanted to win a premiership, but we didn't largely talk about it. We always knew it was there, and I think that's the key to it. Because sometimes big, audacious goals scare people off. If you've got a goal of winning a premiership, which every team does, but if it's written on the board every single day and then suddenly you start 0-4, I think Brisbane are a really good example. Clearly they went into the season wanting to win a premiership, but at 2-5 or whatever they were, I'm sure Chris Fagan would have broken it down. So, guys, don't worry about where we're going in September. We've got to start to worry about how we start to enjoy practice, how we start to practice what we want to do on the weekend, and then how we want to execute on the weekend. So they would have started to break them down into a lot smaller goals, more process-driven. And I think that's what we largely did. Yes, we had a goal of winning a premiership. That was okay, and everyone understood that. But we didn't really talk about it too much because we had to work out what the things we did well on a daily basis and the things we did well on the weekend, which allowed us to win games and then allowed us to win the premiership.
Paul, I'm going to throw some personality traits at you, and you can say yes or no, or just to finish things off. I'm going to start with the word competitive.
Are you asking me, am I competitive, or do you need to be competitive?
No, are you competitive?
Yeah, 100%. I think you can ask my wife and kids whether I'm competitive, even now when I don't play sport. Yeah, absolutely competitive, yes.
Confident.
Yeah, I think I'm confident, but confidence is an interesting word. I mean, confidence often comes through preparation. If I'm prepared, I'm confident. If I'm not prepared, then I'm not confident. So my confidence comes through my preparation.
Serious.
Yeah, some people would say I'm serious. Some people would say I'm not, sort of thing. I think it depends on the setting. I think I have an ability to understand where I'm at and what I need to be. I've good self-awareness of my own personality, and I think I have good self-awareness of other people. So sometimes I'm too serious and sometimes I'm not serious enough.
When you're on the field, were you selfish/arrogant? Did you have to be or not?
That's a really good question. I think when you're a coach, you look at playing differently. I think even the most selfless players are fundamentally selfish because you have to be the best you possibly can. But then you've got a scale of on the field being super selfless. Brett Kirk, the Stewie Maxfield. Where did I sit in that? Probably during my career, I thought I was pretty selfless. When I finished my career, I probably see myself as more selfish player than a selfless player.
Empathetic.
Yeah, I think that was one of my strengths. I think as a coach and as a player, I always had the ability to understand what teammates were going through, understand how to get the best out of them, understand when to be critical of them, when to understand when I wrap my arms around them. So I think that was one of my strengths, definitely.
Paul, on a final note, we've got kids that are playing footy and playing sport at the moment. What's some advice that you give to kids growing up playing AFL or basketball, whatever sport it is nowadays?
I think there's probably a couple of things. Make sure you're getting enjoyment out of it, because sport should be as enjoyable as possible. And then whatever sport it is, just break it down to the fundamentals. I think when I was growing up, tennis for me was just hitting tennis balls over the net, going up. Sometimes I'd go up by myself and hit balls against the wall. You know, I had a basketball ring in the backyard. I kicked the football all the time. So whatever the skills are, just practice. Sounds silly, but just practice the skills of the game. Don't get caught up too much in the strategy of the game when you're really young. The more you can work on your technique, the more you can work on the basics of the game, the more you're going to enjoy it.
Actually, I've got one final question, Paul. Are you proud of your career on the sporting ground?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I don't reflect on it too much. Probably only when I get on podcasts or whether I get interviewed, or I was able to go to the Hall of Fame night for the Sydney Swans, and that, I think that really hit home to me when Kieran Jack, Jared McVeigh, Nick Smith and Heath Grundy got inducted into the Hall of Fame. They didn't really talk about marks, kicks and handballs. They talked about the legacy that they learned from and trying to leave that legacy behind. So I think that was a night where you do reflect on the legacy that you've left. Fitzroy, I enjoyed my time at Fitzroy, got great mates there. And then I think the legacy that we all left at Sydney still stands to this day under John Longmire, which is fantastic.
Paul, thank you so much for being on the Scoreboard podcast. Very much appreciate you taking your time and looking forward to catching up.
Thanks a lot, mate. Really appreciate it.